Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod, the last episode in our collaboration with Working the Future, exploring 10 meta trends impacting the future of work. As we navigate unprecedented changes both inside and outside the workplace, understanding what leadership looks like now and what it might need to look like in the future is more crucial than ever. In this episode, we'll first tackle why 21st century leadership is likely to be markedly different from traditional models, what has shifted in our expectations and realities that demands a new kind of leader and leadership. We'll then identify three drivers reshaping the landscape of leadership, and then looking forward, we'll explore optimistic and pessimistic scenarios of how leaders might adapt to these evolving requirements by 2030. Then finally, we'll discuss practical actions that organizations can take right now to cultivate the kind of leaders and leadership that will thrive in this new era. So whether you're currently in a leadership role, aspire to be a leader, or are simply interested in the forces shaping the future of leadership, this episode will offer some crucial insights, I'm sure. For the final time in this series of podcasts, I'm delighted to welcome co-founder of Working the Future, Cat Barnard, to the podcast. Cat, welcome back.
Thanks, Steve.
And it feels entirely fitting that we've chosen leadership as the very last episode, because all the way through the previous 10 episodes, we've touched on leadership in one way or another. So tell me, why does 21st leadership differ from what we've come to recognize as leadership up to now? Why is it changing?
Well, it's a brilliant question, isn't it? And going back to our 10 trends that we've attempted to unpick in each of the previous episodes, all of those factors, technology, globalization, shifting attitudes towards work, the reskilling emergency, new thinking about organizing models, attention deficit, climate chaos, and more, all of those meta trends warrant a rethink of how we lead our organizations for operating resilience in the 21st century. And therein lies the rub, in too many organizations. I think organizational psychologists would agree that we're still deploying kind of Winslow Taylor's scientific school of management techniques. Still, if you look at the majority of organizations, they are organized in a hierarchical command and control style. Yet what we really need right now is to harness the collective intelligence of the entire remit of internal stakeholders and cohere a far broader, comprehensive, inclusive, ongoing dialogue about what is perceived to be happening within the organization and how it responds optimally to external market forces. And that in and of itself requires a very different management structure, far flatter, more open, egalitarian type of management. There are people whose work I admire greatly who are strong advocates of self-management. So I think most of the things that we have been taught about organizational structures and how we manage and lead organizations needs an overhaul. But most importantly, I think the work of modern leadership is to understand, to go deep and understand the wants, needs, attitudes, motivational drivers of all the stakeholders. So I guess I fervently believe that psychological prowess is now the key, is now key for leadership, an absolute curiosity for other human beings and a curiosity for the world around us.
What's your sense about how realistic it is to expect a leader to have some of these attributes, skills, experiences to be effective in the future? Or are we talking about teams of leaders with complementary skills that may be different, both in terms of the specific skills, but how they're deployed, the underlying behaviors, perhaps, that might be exhibited by leaders, particularly with regard to the way that they interact with people, with other people within the organization. How do some of those dynamics shift, do you think?
I think the most important thing that we have to remember is that we are all born as highly social creatures and highly empathic creatures. We have to remember when a baby comes into the world, when it first opens its eyes, one of the first acts of life is to seek out eye contact with a primary caregiver,
Hmm.
to start building social connections, because those social connections are vital for human survival. So all the skills that I think we now need in business, we are born with. They are innate skills. They are within us when we are born. It is our social structures that condition those skills out of us.
Yeah.
Now, clearly, there is a tiny cohort of people who, if clinically assessed, would receive a diagnosis of psychopathy. And unfortunately, it is true that people with psychopathic traits do often, climb the career ladder and end up in the higher echelons of leadership. I'm not going to name names, but I think we can probably all bring to mind some people in the public eye at the moment that we would probably say, oh my God, that person is a psychopath. However, that is a tiny minority. And I think it's incumbent now on all of us to question what are the key attributes of business, of leadership in business and organizations. And, it's not the traditional textbook literature that you might have been taught at school, university, or in your MBA program.
I mean, one of the things I've observed is that some of the things you've been speaking about, I think, start in education. So when young children first go to a kindergarten, a playgroup, a nursery, they're encouraged to be collaborative. They're encouraged to explore and experiment. They're encouraged to be creative. Then they go to school and college and university, and they're taught to pass exams in very traditional ways. Obviously, I'm generalizing, but you get my point. And then when those students leave education and join the world of work, then employers are looking for creativity and collaborative working and empathy, and all those things that the education system has taught out of children when we spent time investing in them, those very things right at the beginning of education. I always find that fascinating.
I find it fascinating. There's a brilliant book written by Margaret Heffernan called A Bigger Prize, and she actually digs into the way in which education, certainly in the US and the UK, has become just a massive competitive endeavor where it's all about league tables, it's all about grade point averages, it's all about, succeeding and beating your classmates in to become top of the tree, top of the list, etc. And I guess one of the other things that I'm thinking is we know kind of academically that the emotional intelligence skills are needed in our workplaces now. I'm not sure that we know how to measure them. And
Mm.
part of the reason for that is because we've become so codified in our attitude to work. We think we should be able to measure emotional intelligence with some kind of data-driven rule set, whereas in actual fact, you know in your heart and your gut when people are emotionally intelligent. It's
Yeah.
uh, your intuition is part of your emotional intelligence. So what are we doing, man? That's just absolutely nuts. We need to be thinking with our brains and our hearts and our guts. And my goodness me, look at the scientific data that has shown that there are, your brain is one set of neurons, but you have as many neurons in your gut and your heart. So we have this three-part sensor system, but we've been institutionalized into thinking that we only think with our brains. And when we override what our hearts and our guts are telling us, what are we missing, Steve?
Yeah. Does that institutionalization dehumanize us to some extent in the world of work? And I've used that kind of phrase dehumanizing a number of times in these episodes. But is that the conflict perhaps?
Yeah, I think it is. Did I ever tell you the story? My first job after university, and it was, if anyone's listening to this that knows me well, they may have heard the story. But I got this graduate job straight out of university, which was not a graduate job at all. And I was told by the managing director, I questioned the way in which a process was undertaken because I had thought that there was a more efficient way of undertaking this process. And I was told two things. I was told it was my job to do and not to think. And I was told that insubordination amongst the ranks would not be tolerated.
Wow.
But I wonder how much of that thinking goes on in
Yeah.
organizations. Like, you are here, you do. You're not here to think, you're here to do.
Yeah.
And how much apathy and disengagement, that suppression of human curiosity and creativity produces over time.
Yeah. Fascinating. I'm sure there will be people listening that can think of experiences from their own work lives when they perhaps saw that. Hopefully, less more recently, but I'm sure that will resonate with many people. What do you think if we kind of take a bit of a step back? What are three examples of drivers um, that are changing the need for leadership, that are really forcing us to consider different leadership models, different traits
Mm.
associated with leadership in the future?
Great question, and I will try and be concise on this one occasion. So I think worker demand attitudes have changed extraordinarily since the pandemic, and people want very different things. And actually, some wonderful research that was undertaken by Brunswick in 2022 showcased exactly how in demand accessible, authentic leadership is in the 2020s. So modern workers expect to see authentic, transparent, values-driven leadership. And when they don't see it, they're not beholden in the way that they used to be beholden. They will move. And if they can't move because economic circumstances mean that, you just have to stay where you are for the time being, I'm sorry to say, Mr. or Mrs. Leader, but perhaps you need to look at yourself as to why your team is unproductive and disengaged. So that's one. I think complexity, and we've touched on this in previous episodes, it is no longer feasible for an elite squad of senior executives to have all the answers to all the problems. We are so far out at sea, we need every single heart and mind engaged with and by the challenges that we face for that collective intelligence. We have to harness that collective intelligence because no one person can have all of the answers. And if you are in any way trying to control the way in which your field agents or the team that you have operating on the edge of your organization, interfacing on a daily basis with the market. If you're trying to control that, then you are reducing their ability to feed insights, intelligent insight, intelligence gathering back into the heart of the organization. So we have to distribute the decision making. We have to relinquish command and control. We have to decentralize our organizing and trust that the people that we hired in the first place have got the level of intelligence to make sensible decisions that serve the best interests of the organization. And if we genuinely think that we haven't, then there is something wrong with our hiring process, and that's a management and leadership problem. So I would say that. And I would also say much of the academic teaching around business, and that has exploded since I was at university, and I'm sure since you were at university, you know, the amount of business degrees that are now available, the amount of executive MBA programs that are now available, you know, are those teachings up to date?
Yep.
Are they up to date? Are they absolutely on point for the kind of complexity and wicked problems that we are all now facing? So those would be my three.
Yeah, fascinating. Some of the things that particularly struck me there are the idea of authenticity, which is something for a long time I've felt is definitely required in the way that we deal with other people in the organization. Also, really like your point about values driven, and collective intelligence. Actually, deploying and using the skills, the capabilities, the knowledge, the experiences that we have across the organization. And then if we really want to be particularly nimble, then perhaps decentralization is something we should be thinking about as well.
Yeah.
So what are some of the kind of future consequences of getting leadership right in the future, and getting it wrong?
Well, again, I think as we've chatted about off air, I can't. There's just enough dystopian stories, fictions, and films out there to point towards the worst case scenarios. I'm more focused on the best case scenarios. I mean, look, you know, the bottom line is if you can't lead your business will collapse. That's the bottom line.
I've just written down corporate churn because that's one of the kind of the bad case, the pessimistic scenarios, if you like, is increasing corporate churn,
Yeah.
where organizations just fail much more quickly, much more
Yeah.
spectacularly.
And you know, the data is out there and it's openly available. If you look at the Big Biz Trainer research into zombie businesses and the extent to which zombie businesses are now prevalent within the UK economy, that's quite startling. A zombie business is one that has so much debt that all profit is just reabsorbed in servicing the financing of that debt,
Yeah.
right? So that's pretty stark. We are absolutely teetering on the edge of our economic constraints. And the only reason these businesses are still available to operate is because interest rates aren't higher or the financial system is propping up non-viable businesses. But let's look to the more optimistic side of things. I think ethical businesses are going from strength to strength, actually. I think look at the rise in interest in membership bodies like B Corp, 1% for the Planet, the Better Business Act, the Better Business Network. There's a whole kind of sub-economy of really vibrant activity going on. That's not the kind of activity that grabs the media headlines or the mainstream media headlines, but actually you don't have to look too hard to find plenty of organizations who are looking to do things better for the many rather than the few, who are shifting away from stakeholder capitalism shareholder capitalism to multi-stakeholder capitalism, who are looking at things like triple bottom line,
Yeah.
the impact of business on not singularly profits, but also the people and the planet. So I think there's a lot to look around at and to gain solace from. And I think, where are we? We're 2024, 6 years from now, I've no doubt that we will see a stark fork in the road. I mean, even, and I can't remember what the data point is, but even if you look at something like the B Corp movement and the increased profitability that exists within the B Corp membership network, there's lots of exciting things going on there.
One of the things that also strikes me is, and I quite often go back to this, if we're looking at a very balanced perspective on how to lead better, I always think the UN Sustainable Development Goals are a really great template because it gives us everything we've been talking about really through this series, doesn't it?
100%, 100%. And actually at Working the Future, one of the things that we state in our kind of values proposition is that we're particularly interested in the SDG 8, which is, access to good work for everybody. This is not a zero-sum game, right? We can create the futures that we want to leave as a legacy for our grandchildren and great grandchildren, and we get to choose. I'm in business today because being in business gives me agency to choose. And for me, the whole premise of Working the Future is about providing access to opportunity for a greater number of internal stakeholders who can come and collaborate with us and showcase their excellence. And as long as we are all aligned in our vision for raising the bar for everybody, what can go wrong? I said to somebody on a call yesterday, my job as leader isn't to lead you and tell you what to do. My job is to create the conditions for you to go and do the greatest work of your life. Because when you do that, I benefit.
Absolutely clear definition there, a difference between management and leadership. I think you've just shared there. So if we think about what an organization can do right now to start to take on board some of the things we've been speaking about, what sort of things would you suggest?
I think in the C-suite at the exec level, let's start having some open conversations about emotional intelligence and the vital skills that we need in today's leaders and tomorrow's leaders. Let's start talking about, grit and resilience and empathy and self-awareness and curiosity and courage and critical thinking and so on and so forth. We are told time and time again that the advent of artificial intelligence is going to free us up to do creative human work. Well, let's start having the conversation about what those human skills are. And once we're having the good conversations, let's try those let's try those skills on for ourselves. They might feel uncomfortable in the early stages, but as I said before, there's skills that we are born with. So they might feel uncomfortable in the early stages, but actually they are our most comfortable state. And once we are able to try those skills on for size, we can start practicing them in the workplace, because everybody that we are leading needs role models to showcase what good ethical behavior looks and feels like. So actually, in and amongst all of this mix of all of these trends converging and colliding and clashing, the most important thing to remember is that leadership needs to evolve and adapt as well. Each and every one of us needs to upgrade our thinking to meet the requirements of the coming years and decades. And the most straightforward thing that we can do to set us on that path is to prioritize the relationships that we have. and the community that we've built within our organizations, because that is everything. If you can cohere consensus and provide a shining North Star to your internal teams, a vision that they can buy into, you're cooking on gas. So your communication skills need to be exemplary. This is about strategy and stakeholders. And that's the grand design, is creating a vision that everybody can buy into. And when you can do that, disengagement disappears and everybody is encouraged to fulfill their own potential in a way that serves the organization at large.
I particularly like that observation that about, why wouldn't leadership need to adapt and evolve, given that what we're constantly talking about is how the outside world is constantly adapting and evolving, from technology to social trends to political shifts, whatever they might be. And the way that we lead organizations and lead people surely should need to change, evolve, and adapt as well. Kind of common sense, really, isn't it, when you think about it?
100%, 100%. And, again, look to science. What do we know about genetic inheritance? What do we know about evolution? And I'm very inspired. This is a bit hippie. I'm very inspired by a psychologist, Steve Taylor, who teaches at Leeds Beckett University in the north of the UK. And one of the questions that he's posed in one of his books is about evolution. And there is an assumption that I think we make because of Darwinism, that we think that evolution is the shift forward of physical traits. We think about animals, creatures that grow different physical traits to adapt to their environment. And the question that I believe Taylor poses is, what if evolution is psychological as well as physical? And what if the next phase of our human evolution is a raised level of consciousness that is far more inclusive and far more in tune with the planetary constraints that we face? That's a game changer right there. That is a game changer. If we raise our levels of consciousness to think differently about the world in which we exist and interoperate, and we understand our human interconnectedness, that is a game changer.
And doesn't that tie everything together that we've been speaking about, from globalization, technology, reskilling, talent, through leadership?
100%.
Cat, that's been absolutely brilliant. Another wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, not just for this episode, but the previous 10 as well. I think we've covered some absolutely enormous, topics, a vast amount of ground. And I would certainly commend the report that you and your business partner have put together, examining in much more depth than we've been able to in these podcasts, these 10 critical meta trends. So thank you very, very much for your time across all of these podcasts.
Steve, honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure and a joy. And, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for suggesting the exercise, because it's been brilliant and it would never have come to fruition without your hard work. So, straight back at you. Huge kudos. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks ever so much. In the podcast description, you'll find a link to Working the Future and also to the report that we've been talking about. And you'll also find some contact information for Cat. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And do tell your friends and colleagues about the Informing Choices mini pod. We'll see you on another episode very soon.